Welcome to the Washington Examiner's In Focus podcast. I'm senior editor Peter Laffin. Today, I'm excited to be joined by former New Hampshire Senator and current New Hampshire Senate candidate, John Sununu. Senator, how's the campaign treating you this time around?
Great. I've always enjoyed my campaigns. Lamar Alexander wrote a book, The Little Plaid Book. Lamar was a candidate for president back in 2000, I think it was. And it was a bunch of sayings, great things about, campaigns, what it's like to be out there. And he said, if you don't enjoy campaigning, and in particular, if you don't like listening to someone talk about their children or grandchildren, you shouldn't be running for office. So, I've always enjoyed being on the campaign trail, talking to people about New Hampshire, talking to people about what their issues are, what they're focused on. And yeah, if you don't enjoy campaigning, you should probably be looking for, some other way to contribute in public life.
Well, I know that a lot of people up in New Hampshire, in the Republican Party in New Hampshire, are very excited that you're out there campaigning right now. Back in mid-October, I spoke to some folks that I know in the New Hampshire Republican Party, and they were concerned by the state of the Senate race. At that point, Scott Brown was the only candidate who'd gotten in, and he was polling very poorly against Chris Pappas. And meanwhile, you were polling very, neck and neck or a little bit ahead of Pappas. And so I've been curious since that happened, what was the moment like when you finally decided, hey, I'm going to get in this? What was it that knocked you over?
Just thinking hard about how important it was and the fact that New Hampshire hadn't had a Republican representing New Hampshire, representing the state in Washington in a decade. And I knew that if I got in the race, if I ran, I could win, I would win. And frankly, if I didn't, we would probably end up with another liberal Democrat going to Washington, picking a fight with the president, not being an effective advocate for New Hampshire. At that time, there were two others in the race. Senator Dan Innes was also an announced candidate for Senate. Once I got in the race, Dan dropped out and endorsed me. And we've really been able to build a very broad coalition across the entire Republican spectrum, activists, people in the grassroots, but also people who have run for office, people who are in leadership positions in New Hampshire that know this is the best opportunity we'll have in New Hampshire to win this Senate seat.
So you've centered your campaign around fiscal responsibility and protecting entitlements. I've been curious what you thought of the final product of the One Big Beautiful Bill, particularly as it relates to entitlement reform. Is there anything that was in the bill that you're particularly enthusiastic about? And is there anything in the bill that you would change?
Well, a couple of things. First, I wouldn't say I've centered my whole campaign around that. I mean, taxes are important to people in New Hampshire, no question. We have no sales tax, no income tax. And it's really the low tax nature of New Hampshire that's kept power and money in the pockets of families and small businesses. And it's one of the real strengths of New Hampshire. It's why our economy is the strongest in New Hampshire, or strongest in New England. Our poverty rate is the lowest in New England. Our income growth is the strongest in New England. So taxes are important. I've talked about affordability when I did my announcement. I didn't have to wait for an election to know that people are still pressed by the 20% growth in prices that we experienced under the Biden administration, right? Prices went up 20%. They don't go down. I mean, we can fight back and lower inflation to 2% or 3%. But the damage was really done, in the years that we had 8 and 9% inflation. So affordability is an issue, healthcare, energy, housing, certainly talking about those. But on the big, beautiful bill, two things, right? One, on the spending side, which is the real thrust of your question, we added a work requirement for able-bodied people under Medicaid. I think that's something that's common sense to people in New Hampshire. You should be looking for work at least, maybe work or maybe give time to a nonprofit or be working. That's a very reasonable requirement for someone, an able-bodied person without dependents who's on the Medicaid program. So they added that in the bill, and it saves significant money. They added provisions that keep illegal immigrants from claiming Medicaid. Again, I think that's common sense. So it was a step in the right direction, to be sure. And then on the other side, the taxes, you're correct. I believe in low taxes coming from New Hampshire. I think that's the best way to make families more powerful, government less powerful. And we finally made the tax code permanent, right? On the individual side, on the business side, they took the tax cuts that were put in place in 2017 and made them permanent. So now people know what to expect, whether you're an individual or a business. You know what to expect from the tax code in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, instead of the uncertainty that plagued us when we were forever fighting over making provisions permanent or not permanent.
So another thing I've seen you talk a lot about so far in this campaign is lowering the temperature in Washington. Now we're obviously in a time of rising political violence, and in the past year, I think what can only be described as a left-wing political assassination spree. How might you go about solving such an intractable problem?
Sure. Look, you don't solve a problem with a simple phrase or solve it overnight. But I think the point I was making there is members of Congress shouldn't be going to Washington simply to raise their social media profile or pick a fight. There's just a little too much of that going on. And I mentioned our liberal delegation in New Hampshire, 2 Democrat senators, 2 Democrat House members. Sometimes it feels like they're going to Washington every week to pick a fight with the president. And that's not really going to accomplish anything. I mean, I'll take a stand. I'll fight for what I believe in, what I believe is right for New Hampshire. We talked about taxes. To fight for what I believe is right for New Hampshire to get more power and control over our education dollars, our Medicaid dollars. Bring them to New Hampshire without the red tape. Bring them to New Hampshire without the strings attached. So, these are things worth fighting for. But I just think we need more people in Washington, one, with real experience. My background's in manufacturing and technology. I'm an engineer by training, not a lawyer. Ran a small business in Manchester for 3 years before I was elected to Congress. So, more real world experience, and more people that know how to get things done. I wrote and passed an internet tax ban when I was in the Senate, even though we had Democrat control of the Senate, because I knew how to get things done. I put the Democrats in a bad spot. They were very uncomfortable, and they eventually caved in and went along with the legislation I had.
Your opponent, your primary opponent, Scott Brown, he told me in October, I want to read you this quote, that while John was supporting John Kasich in 2016, I was campaigning with Donald Trump. And while John was wooing the DC establishment this summer, I've been working with grassroots activists across the Granite State. He seems to really be attempting to tether himself to the president. What do you make of that?
Well, two things. One, I already talked about the breadth of the support we have in New Hampshire. Real grassroots support is when you have, state senators, state representatives, activists, the leadership of Donald Trump's presidential campaign in New Hampshire, all have supported me. At 6, 7, 8 people that had previously endorsed my opponent have decided to endorse me now that I'm in the race. So the support across the state, across the breadth of the party, has absolutely been there. New Hampshire has a great tradition of presidential primaries. I didn't support the president in the primary. He won the primary. He won the election, and he keeps winning on, we were talking about the bill on taxes, on spending, on the borders, securing the borders. I mean, what a transition, what a change we have from where we were 2 years ago. Thousands of people crossing the border illegally. I mean, really a human tragedy. And we were told that you couldn't do anything about it. President Trump and the administration has obviously turned that around. So I'm looking forward to working with the president, working with the administration, being an advocate for New Hampshire. I'm absolutely confident I'll be the most effective person that New Hampshire can send to Washington to work with the Trump administration. And I'm very excited about the support I have from the president's team in New Hampshire.
So New Hampshire is thought of as a potential pickup state for the Republicans, and more so now that you're in the race. People broadly think of you as the strongest candidate to go up against who's likely to be the Democratic nominee, Chris Pappas. And so, what distinguishes you and the Republican Party going forward from the Pappas Democrats? Why is it so important that you beat him in this particular race?
Well, start with what it means to New Hampshire. I said when I announced, I'll have one job, stand up for New Hampshire every single day. Look across the state, understand what's right for the state in terms of priorities on education, taxes, healthcare, the regulatory environment, and stand up for that in Washington. By contrast, when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker, Chris Pappas voted with her 222 out of a possible 223 times. That's outrageous. It's not good for New Hampshire. That's not leadership, whatever state you're from. Voting with a leadership from San Francisco, again, just not the right thing to do 99.5% of the time. So that's a huge contrast. And I think that's one that's really, really important to the people and the voters of the state of New Hampshire. There's also a difference in background and experience, coming from a manufacturing and small business background, having a successful career in the private sector and technology and areas of innovation. My opponents have called that being a corporate sellout. My family calls it having a real job. Actually working with businesses that are making decisions to invest capital, build plants, create jobs, and create products and to serve the market. So we just don't have enough of that in Washington, and I'm excited to be able to bring that where it's so needed.
What do you make of the changes on the left more broadly with the rise of the Mamdani Democrats and this real embrace of communism and kind of hardcore communism among the young on the left? What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think a lot of that's a phenomena of New York City and the unusual election that they had, where you were left with a very flawed independent candidate in Andrew Cuomo that had been plagued by scandals, personal scandals, and Mamdani, who was certainly a young, charismatic figure, and who, very successfully sort of pretended he didn't really stand for all the things that he had represented or talked about before. Look, I don't think socialism, communism plays very well in New Hampshire. I think people in New Hampshire are sort of smart, well-educated. They've been participating aggressively, actively in politics at the presidential level and the local level for years and years. I talked about some of the things that matter to people in New Hampshire, like low taxes and local control. It's an independent spirit. It's pretty far removed from New York City politics. So I think you put the right message, highlight the right issues for people in New Hampshire, you're going to be successful. And again, I circle back to the idea of having a liberal legislator that's just voting with Democratic leadership from New York City or New York City, Chuck Schumer from New York City, Nancy Pelosi from San Francisco, voting with that leadership day in and day out isn't really doing New Hampshire any good.
So you're running to fill your old seat, and there was one person in between you.
Well, it's not my old seat. It's not my seat. It's just it's a Senate seat
The
in New
seat
Hampshire,
you,
and
the seat
I
you
was
once
lucky enough to
inhabited.
hold it. I did hold it for 6 years. That's correct. But nothing is given in politics. Nothing should be expected.
What do you make of the job done by the person who took that seat from you 16 years ago? And how would you grade her performance in the Senate in those 16 years?
I'll reserve my grading to my students at St. Anselm's College. But I will say, Senator Shaheen did step up with the government shutdown and was willing to try to find a way to get government back open again. Look, my perspective is because she understood what I certainly understand, having been there before, The government shutdowns never work. They never serve any purpose. I never voted to shut down the government. So she, to her credit, was able to negotiate an agreement to get government reopened. And what I find astounding is that Chris Pappas, my opponent in the general election, voted against that agreement negotiated by his own Democratic leadership in New Hampshire in the Senate. The New Hampshire senators both thought that this was the right thing for our state to reopen government. And Chris Pappas said, no, I'm going to stick with the New York City, San Francisco liberal leadership in the House and vote against New Hampshire. So I certainly give her credit. And I was a little surprised that that Pappas threw her under the bus.
What makes New Hampshire such a fantastic state?
Well, look, what makes New Hampshire such a fantastic state? It's the best place in the country to live and work and raise a family. It starts with that commitment to low taxes. And look, money is power. And if you keep taxes low in your state, that's more power, money and power in the hands of individuals and families and small businesses. And that has driven success and opportunity in New Hampshire. We have a great education system because we still, more than most any other state, give power and money to local cities and towns to determine how best to invest that to improve education. And obviously, live free or die, there is a strong commitment and belief in the concepts of ideas of personal responsibility, taking initiative, and serving your community. When my father first ran for governor in 1982, people looked at him and said, "Come on, you can't get elected in New Hampshire with a name like Sununu." And we even had radio ads where, with a jingle or a question, "What's a Sununu?" Making light of it. The real fact is, though, that my mother was the first successful politician in the family. She was chairman of the school board when I was in middle school. And that's real politics. School board is real politics anywhere, but certainly in New Hampshire. And, from her, I got a real sense of what it was to provide leadership, to be tough, to be honest with people, to really believe in what you're doing. And that's something I've carried with me my whole life. She was chairman of the Republican Party in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected. And, it's been about public service. At the same time, I've never believed you should run for office just because you want to hold office. I've been very happy in the private sector in the last 15 years. I haven't been spending my time trying to figure out how to get back into public life. I just saw this as an important opportunity to give New Hampshire the voice that we deserve and we need in Washington.
Well, Senator, I wish you all the luck in the world in the rest of this campaign, and I hope you'll check back in with us soon. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Great to be with you. Hope we do it again.